Welcome to the Lentil Intervention Podcast, talking all things movement, whole food nutrition and environmental wellness with your hosts, Ben and Emma.
Hello everybody, my name is Ben Eidelberg.
And I'm Emma Strutt.
And welcome to episode 22 for the year. As always, before you continue listening, please make sure you hit the subscribe button in your app and later share this podcast with your friends and family. And also, as always, if you do find our content interesting and inspiring, please do buy us a coffee. All our details on our website. Emma, we've got a very special situation here, a very special reason why we have our next guest. I'll let you get on with the intros.
That's right. So we've had some really great listener questions come through lately, including a fantastic one from Jez in regards to chemical food contaminants like pesticides and pollutants and GMOs. So there was many layers to this question. And look, his question is definitely a common concern. I feel like I need to answer these questions all the time in my dietetic practice. So we figured that this warrants a whole show rather than just answering this in an express app. And we thought we should bring in the best of the best to talk to us about this. So we are thrilled to be joined by Professor Ian Shaw from the University of Canterbury today. Ian is a highly regarded expert on food safety. He's chaired the UK Pesticide Residues Committee, has worked as the National Food Safety Program Manager at the Institute of Environmental Science and Research in Christchurch. Ian is also a New Zealand Food Safety Authority member and has published extensively in this space. He's literally written the book on food safety. And he also has some highly entertaining and fascinating TEDx talks. So Ian is also a master science communicator. Whew, I'm pretty exhausted from reading out your extensive resume, Ian, so I'll just bring you on the show now. Professor Shaw, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be here, and I must say I sounded an awful lot better than I am.
And there's no video, and there's no video here either. Professor Shaw, we certainly watched some of your TEDx presentations, and they've certainly been very entertaining. There's a lot of stuff we'd love to cover, but we're very limited with that. So we're going to start off with one of the fundamental basics with all our guests. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and also why you moved to New Zealand.
Okay, so we've got this is a 4-hour program, is it?
In part, yeah. This is part one.
Okay. Background: I started off as a biochemist with a degree in biochemistry, and then did a degree of PhD in toxicology, and then worked for a while as an academic at University College, and then moved from there to the Ministry of Agriculture, where I became head of food safety in the UK. And then I moved from there to the pharmaceuticals industry, which is a bit of a strange move, but I wanted to see how the industry worked. And then I moved into the university and became a professor of toxicology. And then the big move to New Zealand. And that happened because I just met a partner, and we'd met in Indonesia, and we moved back to England, and we decided it'd be good to start a new life somewhere that either of us hadn't lived before. And at the same time, we'd met quite a lot of people from New Zealand in Indonesia. And at the same time, when we got back to England, I noticed advertised a job as a food safety program manager in New Zealand. So I thought I'd apply. And the same day, I had a call from a headhunting company saying, "Did you know there's a job available in New Zealand?" And the next week I was in New Zealand for the interview. And at the end of that week, I got the job, and the rest is history. And that was 20 years ago. And so we moved here 20 years ago, and we love the place.
Oh, so you're local these days?
Oh, absolutely. I've gone bush now. I can even recognise an Australian accent.
That's the true sign.
It seems I'm a linguist as well.
Now, before we get into a deep dive regarding chemical food contaminants, would you mind just setting the scene a little bit for us in regards to the actual decision-making process that's behind actually setting these standards and regulations of the chemicals used in food?
Yeah. That's actually reasonably simple. It takes a bloody long time to do, but it's reasonably simple. So, but basically, we, or the regulatory committee, and all countries would have their own regulatory committees. Usually the committee would be an external body like the one in the UK that I chaired, that actually looks at the data and then recommends to the government body whether or not a chemical should be licensed. But that committee looks at two things. It looks at the risk, and I'll talk about that in a sec, and it looks at the benefit of the compound. So the risk would be any toxicological issues relating to the environment, or relating to people that might be exposed to the chemical. And they might be exposed via food residues, or perhaps being farmers spraying a pesticide, they will be exposed directly. Or, you and me walking through a field that's just been sprayed, taking the dogs a walk, we will get exposed as well. And all of those exposures are looked at on the risk side. And the exposure gives you an idea of how much of the chemical you might be exposed to. But then the intrinsic toxicity of the chemical, the hazard of the chemical, is also known. So we would know that from extensive animal studies and environmental studies to say what sort of levels of chemical are toxic. So you put those two together to get an idea of the overall risk. And, give you an idea, if we were looking at an organophosphorus pesticide, the risk would be high. If we were looking at a pyrethroid insecticide, the risk would be lower. If we were looking at a pheromone to attract insects to a pesticide, the risk would be infinitesimally tiny. Then on the other side of the spectrum, we look at the benefit. So what's the compound going to be used for? What impact will it have on agriculture or whatever? So if we've got something like glyphosate, the main component, the active component of the herbicide Roundup, it has a fairly low risk, or that is quite a moot point at the moment, but its usefulness is incredibly great. And so you can't see me, I'm weighing up here, but you weigh up that risk against the benefit. And if the benefit wins, then the compound can be licensed. And if the risk wins, the compound can't be licensed. I've made it sound incredibly simplistic. To get an idea of this, in an average regulatory committee, the sort of thing that I've been on many times and chaired on many occasions as well, the amount of data that you would have from the agrochemicals company putting in a license application would fill 2 or 3 small rooms, and usually would be handled with some sort of forklift truck to bring the data out when you need to look at it. Now most of this will be electronic, but that just gives you an idea of the amount of data and the time it would normally take to make a decision about, for example, a new pesticide, including the regulatory authorities going through the data and making sure it's all correct, will probably be 6 or 7 weeks, with the final committee meeting taking a whole day. So it's not as simple as I make it sound. Oh, what's the risk? Oh, yeah, it's all right. What's the benefit? Oh, it's better. Let's license it. It's not like that. It's very, very long, drawn-out process. And very often during that process, questions go back to the company saying we need more information on X or Y.
Yeah, okay. So I suppose with anything, the dose makes the poison.
You've got it in one.
So the risk and the hazard are pretty, that's kind of well known, but the exposure will vary from person to person, I suppose. So how is exposure and the residue intake estimates calculated?
Yeah. I mean, if you're looking at exposures, they can be from all sorts of routes, and I mentioned some of them just, but let's focus, as I think you want us to, on residues, because that will be probably the most important potential exposure route for humans following the licensing of a pesticide. So the way that's done is to calculate what's called the MRL. Now, people might know what this means, but I'll just explain it. This is the maximum residue level, or limit, depending on which country you're in. We'll call it level for now. And that's calculated by looking at the pesticide's use in anger, as it were, when the pesticide is being used to treat a crop. And the amount of residue, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a minute, the amount of residue on the crop is the MRL. So this is saying if the pesticide is used as per the label properly, that's the MRL. If any pesticide exceeds that MRL, it's illegal to trade in that food product. But the important point is that there's no toxicology used directly in determining that MRL. However, there's significant toxicology carried out to determine the levels of pesticide that can be applied to the crop. So sort of indirectly, that MRL does reflect the toxicology of the compound. Does that make sense? So when you've got the MRL, that's the regulatory level against which the pesticide is measured. So if in routine testing the level of a pesticide exceeds the MRL, then the country would have to withdraw that product from the market.
Mm-hmm.
And that MRL is for specific chemicals or specific pesticides. But how does one then take into account if multiple chemicals or multiple pesticides are used concurrently?
Yeah, that's an extremely good question. You're absolutely right. It's one compound. And the problem is, and it's a huge problem, is that we take no account of multiple pesticides whatsoever. And this is something I'm really very interested in. I've written a few papers on it actually over the last couple of years. And so each compound is monitored in its own right, individually. Now, for most things, no, it's not true. For a lot of things, that probably isn't a huge problem. But for chemicals, I'll give you an example in a minute, that might act by the same mechanism. Then if they're acting by the same mechanism, their residues levels effectively add up in an activity sense. So I'll give you an example. Organophosphorus pesticides in oranges. I did a big study a long time ago in the 1990s. And we looked at the levels of organophosphorus pesticides on oranges and found lots of different OPs, organophosphorus pesticides. Couldn't really understand why a farmer would use lots of different OPs. Then it suddenly dawned on me, they each have their own MRL. So if he uses a mixture, or she uses a mixture of organophosphorus pesticides, OPs, then each one will be below its MRL, but the effect on killing the insects will be the sum of the whole lot. And that's sort of getting around the regulations a little bit. But from the point of view of human exposure and impact on human health, it's the sum of those pesticide levels that matters, not only the individual levels.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but as part of calculating the estimates that are okay, are dietary surveys used to kind of...
Yeah, they are. Yeah. And that's, again, a very good question. And different countries do it in different ways, but basically it's dietary surveys. So in New Zealand, for example, we have a total diet survey, which is carried out every 4 years. I used to run that, actually, when I worked for ESR, the Institute of Environmental Science and Research. And what happens there is, I can't remember the details in great detail, but a certain number of samples of foods are collected from food outlets. They might be from supermarkets, they could even be from a restaurant. Then these samples of food are analysed for a suite of pesticides, and this will depend upon what might be of interest at a particular time, or it might include just a list of basic pesticides. It varies from survey to survey. And then when those levels are found, then the level is multiplied by the average daily intake of each of these foods. And these are carried out from a different dietary survey, which looks at how much cabbage people eat, how much potatoes people eat, how much beef they eat, and so on. So then you can get a total intake of each of the pesticides. And the total intake can be compared with a value called the acceptable daily intake. And this is based on toxicology. And the acceptable daily intake is the maximum amount that you or I or anyone else can take in our diet that will have no effect on us if we eat that for every day of our lives. So it's a very extreme toxicological value. If a total dietary survey residue of a pesticide exceeds the ADI, that's a big issue for the regulatory authorities. Even though it's very unlikely to exceed that every day for somebody's life, it's still a very, very big issue. Yeah. Other countries, in the UK, for example, does it slightly differently. They target particular pesticides in particular foods. And so I used to chair the working party in the UK that did this. And so what we did, we would look at different groups of foods. We would look at foods that were considered as staples, like potatoes and rice and bread. And we would look at foods that considered commonly consumed, like carrots and perhaps swedes and apples. And then foods that were rarely consumed, and these would be things like dates and figs and persimmon, or things like this. And we would look at the levels of selected pesticides that were known to be used on those crops and calculate the intakes based on the intake surveys, just in the same way. But that's a really important way to distinguish foods, because if you find residues exceeding the ADI in staples, that's much more of a problem than if you find residues exceeding the ADI in a food that's very rarely consumed. And for example, in my time, we found a problem with a particular residue of pesticide in milk. And that was lindane. And that led to a huge furore and milk being taken off the market for 3 days. Whereas if we'd found that pesticide in apricots or in dates, I wouldn't have been as worried. I would have sat back and said, well, let's actually look where it's coming from. It shouldn't be there, but we're not going to cause significant harm because people don't eat huge amounts of dates and apricots, perhaps.
So, I mean, for the people that are out there that are eating very large amounts of fresh produce, for example, should they be more concerned about this than the average Joe that consumes more processed foods, or is that wriggle room great enough to kind of allow for these variations?
I'm going to qualify this a bit in a minute, because I'm good at qualifying everything I say to be absolutely certain. But no, I don't think they should be. And the reason they shouldn't be is that the regulatory processes in Australia, in New Zealand, in the UK, in Japan, in all the good countries, South Africa, your place, They're so robust that we would find if there's a big issue. The issue with finding that big issue is it's retrospective. So since you're doing a survey on foods, you don't hold those foods in a big tank somewhere until you get the results of the survey. They're just telling the minister for the Ministry of Health or wherever they're going to that there is an issue with a particular pesticide. Then that minister will deal with that, but it won't be dealt with retrospectively. So the issues with someone who might be a greenie, for example, eating a whole load of fruit and vegetables like I do, and they might be concerned about that. The issue actually is whether they're eating the vegetables they grew themselves or the vegetables they buy from the supermarket. And a lot of people are going to switch this podcast off when I say the next thing. So goodbye, if you're just about to turn off. There's probably a bigger problem if you grew the stuff in your garden or bought it from someone who'd grown it in their garden than if you buy it from the supermarket. And the reason for that is that the supermarket's suppliers are highly regulated and the MRLs are highly scrutinized to make sure, in fact, that the levels are not exceeding the MRL. People still may be worried that there's a level of a pesticide there that they don't want to be there. They don't want to be eating a pesticide. From my perspective and a toxicological perspective, I'm not worried about that because I'm worried more about whether they can cause you harm or not, rather than whether you're unhappy about eating them. That sounds harsh, but it's the harm that worries me. We did a study in the UK, I think about 1999, where we looked at levels of pesticides in home produce. And we were particularly worried, not about you and I growing it in our own garden, because if we want to grow the stuff without pesticides, we can, and that's no problem. But there's quite a lot of people growing some stuff and putting it at their gate and selling it. And usually the residues of pesticides were greater in those products than in the ones from the supermarket. And we did a bit of questionnaire study actually with some people that do exactly this. And it was all done anonymously so they couldn't be traced. But we asked them why they thought the levels might be high and they didn't know. So we asked them how they apply their pesticide, and they did exactly what it said on the bottle, put one capful into a watering can and water it on. But then when we asked them how much they actually watered compared with the amount that it said they should water, 90% of them said they watered more of it because they thought a bit more might do it better, which means, of course, that the residues will be higher. And so that was a real inconsistent finding in many ways, but made a lot of sense. So in the UK at that time, labelling was changed to make sure that people that bought home garden chemicals were warned that they should literally only stick to the amount that it says on the label and not overwater because they think that might make it better. So very often, the residues levels are higher in those sort of products than the things you might find in the supermarket.
And with homegrown or locally grown, is there also the risk, and this we'll talk about organic foods later on, but is there also the same, issue of contaminants in terms of, if you're living in a very sort of urbanized area, then some of those contaminants could also come from air pollution, or there's been a sewage leak in the soil you're not aware of, and then that comes through. I mean, there's other facets, but again, they're not being tested. So you just don't know what that produce is actually producing.
Yeah, and that could be the case. But I would think, I've never seen any studies specifically on this, but I would think that farm produce has got the same sort of problems. They're in they've got the same air dropping on them, and they could get pollution the same way. But it's not necessarily absolutely true that those residues aren't measured, because we do measure some standard pollution measures as well. Like, for example, DDT is still measured, even though we don't use it any longer. And PCBs are measured, and some other organic contaminants are measured as well. So, I mean, some of these are measured. They're not measured every single survey, but they're measured sporadically to see what's going on. But you're quite right. The environmental pollution is very important in that context.
I was just going to ask about DDT. So you mentioned that, and I think most people would know that, we don't use it anymore. It was banned, I think, in the 80s in Australia and New Zealand. But
it's not actually banned. It's restricted.
Oh, restricted.
It's allowed to be used by the World Health Organization to eradicate
for malaria.
Anopheles mosquitoes. Yeah.
But is there a concern regarding DDT residue in New Zealand? Because I know it was used extensively in the 60s for that grass scrub. Is there much remaining?
We manufactured it, didn't we?
Yes, we did. Yes, a lot of it was bought from overseas, but it was manufactured here. Yeah. I'm going to get told to leave New Zealand after I say the next few words, so we hope it does take some while to hear this. because they won't like this. Yeah, New Zealand does have a particular problem with this. And the reason is that DDT was used, as you point out, in the 50s and early 60s. It was actually used to kill the grass grub. And grass grubs they were introduced to New Zealand with grass, and they became a real problem because they ate the roots, which meant the grass didn't grow very well, which means the sheep and the cattle didn't have enough grass to eat. So DDT was the saviour, and it was used in very high doses to kill grass grub. And at the time, we've got to be fair, people really saw it as the Holy Grail. They didn't see it as problematic at all. And I even remember as a kid in the UK seeing adverts on the television with somebody from, as it was then, ICI, Imperial Chemical Industries, who marketed DDT, actually licking a pile of DDT on his hand to say, look how safe it is. And, I didn't drop dead during this advert. The fact it's a long-term toxin might mean he's not too well a bit later, a few years later on, but in the advert it's perfectly okay. But DDT has a very long half-life in the environment. It lasts for a very long time. So that the half-life's the time, as I'm sure you know, for it to take and for it to disappear or decrease by half its concentration. And for something like an organophosphorus pesticide, that would probably be measured in a number of days, like 8. For DDT, it's somewhere between 50 and 150 years, depending how you measure it. So most of the DDT that was put into New Zealand and any other country is still there. And if cattle graze grass that's contaminated with DDT, it's normally in the soil, so they have to actually pick up some of the soil. Milk is basically fat globules floating around in water with some calcium in there. And DDT is very soluble in fat, and so it's present in milk. And so the dietary intake for DDT will come through things like milk. And that has been a problem for New Zealand because Japan measured DDT in our milk and did not like it. And they said, we ain't buying your milk, mate. And New Zealand had to look very carefully at how they could decrease the amount of DDT in milk. And they did this quite brilliantly. New Zealand's very good at being incredibly pragmatic. And what they decided was, this is in a nutshell, so there's more detail that I should really give you. I won't, because you don't need the whole lot, is instead of making a law to say, thou shalt not feed thy cattle on grass containing DDT, the milk company, Fonterra, said, we won't buy milk off you if it's got higher than a certain level of DDT in it. I'm very sorry. You'll have to do something else with your milk. But you can reduce the level of DDT in your milk by measuring DDT in your soil. And if it's above a certain level, don't graze your cows on it. And I'd love to show you a graph, but it's no good on radio. But if you look at the levels of DDT since that started in milk, they have literally dropped. And it's now down at very, very low levels. But we know the levels in soil basically are still the same. So by targeting farmers to put their cattle to graze on fields that are less likely to have DDT has reduced the milk problem significantly. I've gone off track there a little bit, but it's interesting to see how you can actually reduce pesticide levels by a very pragmatic approach.
We've covered DDT and most people know about that, but since that was restricted, there's been a plethora of new kind of herbicides, insecticides, pesticides, fungicides brought onto the market. What are some of the main ones that are used in Australia and New Zealand? And I think you've already kind of covered it, but are there potential health issues associated with that?
Should we just start with DDT? Because I think it's a good place to start.
Yeah,
I mean, as I said, it's got a hell of a long half-life, and we don't like things that hang around a long time. Toxicity-wise, acute toxicity is extremely low. The bloke licking it on the TV, he didn't drop dead. It's perfectly okay. Long-term toxicity, we actually don't know. We're worried about it because it hangs around for so long, but there's very little evidence to show that it does anything terrible, which is quite interesting because we're frightened of DDT, and if you hear about DDT in your food, you wouldn't eat it. So we replaced DDT with pesticides, the organophosphorus pesticides, which are much shorter lived. And that was the idea. Get rid of these things that hang around for a long time, that there might be residues in food for many, many years. But the organophosphorus pesticides, I said earlier, they are OPs, are very, very much more toxic acutely. And they cause problems immediately in farmers spraying them. And in the UK particularly, they're applied to sheep by dipping the sheep to kill ticks and lice on the sheep. And lots of farmers that dipped them got all the classic symptoms. I used to be a consultant toxicologist in a hospital in the north of the UK where all the dipping's done. And we'd just be waiting during the dipping season. All these farmers would come in with streaming eyes, drooling mouths. You say, oh no, you've been dipping, got to give you this antidote. So it was very interesting to see that. Then that was a problem. And so people didn't like the idea of organophosphates because they have an environmental impact that's quite great. They have a very short half-life. So they were replaced then by the pyrethroid insecticides, which are based on pyrethrin, which is present in chrysanthemums, and the Chinese 5,000 years ago used to mash up chrysanthemums in water and put it onto their crops. Quite amazing. They were using these pesticides. And they have a much shorter half-life in very small number of days. Their toxicity level is much lower, but they're a damn sight more expensive than OPs. So it's okay for our countries because we got lots of money, but it's not much good for people trying to farm in Africa and places where there isn't a lot of money. So you tend to find that DDT is, even though illegally, still used in some countries. And organophosphorus pesticides are the most commonly used. I lived and worked in Indonesia for quite a while and did quite a lot of work on pesticide use in Indonesia. And we found residues of DDT in women's milk. And the levels were so high that they really had to be applying the pesticide. And then we found out that, in fact, in Indonesia, the women tend to do the applications of pesticides. And then I spent a bit of time actually learning to speak Indonesian so I could talk to them on farms and looking at what they do. And lo and behold, they all went along to these farms. They had a little sort of dais in the middle of the fields. All their babies went on there, and they had one mum that looked after all the babies and fed them, a bit like a creche. And all the other mums went out and sprayed the fields, and they're spraying with DDT. They absorbed them, and it got taken into their milk, and then they fed the babies on the DDT later. So, there's good evidence that in third world or developing countries, DDT is still used because it's cheap. But in terms of the toxicity of these things, the shorter lived ones tend to have, there's no connection actually, but they tend to have a greater toxicity. But of course, they're very much more effective as well at killing insects. So you can have a short, sharp attack. Now, when these pesticides were first introduced, like the OPs and the pyrethroid insecticides, they were used willy-nilly. And farmers would spray them every 3 weeks to make sure that their crops aren't attacked by insects. Later on, it became clear that the residues were building up and that wasn't a good idea, and regulations were beginning to come in about residues in food. So now we have processes in place that enshrine in regulation and the law that pesticides should only be applied when they're needed. So now integrated pest management is the way to go, where farmers should go around, look at their crops. If there's a problem, spray, and if there isn't, don't. And that significantly reduces the residues levels and significantly reduces the amount of pesticide that might be used. I've rattled on a bit there. I don't know whether that really answered your question.
No, I think it's very helpful to understand the full backstory, because oftentimes it's quite an emotional subject and people have fears, but they don't really understand the ins and outs of what goes into the decision-making process. So I think that's very helpful. Okay, so we've mentioned the risk to the farmers. So that is very, very unfortunate. At the other end, so the consumer, once they actually buy the food, any risk there that they should be aware of?
Well, let's just put the farming one to bed for a few seconds, because the farmer can protect themselves against those risks. They can wear gloves, they can wear protective clothing. They don't, that's their problem. At the other end of the spectrum, which why I say this, we don't have a choice. I mean, we can choose to eat food, organic food, which doesn't, in theory, we'll talk about this later, contain pesticide residues, but it's usually more expensive. That's good, no problem with any of that at all. But we don't have a choice generally. If you go and buy a loaf of bread from the store, you don't know whether it's got residues in. It certainly won't have been measured. It might have been part of a total diet survey, but certainly you won't know the levels there. You hope that the regulations are maintaining the levels low enough for them not to cause you any health effects. We know that there's little or no account taken of cocktails of pesticides, the cocktail effect, where you've got one pesticide in your bread, another one in your potatoes, another one in your peas, and so on and so forth. But I think it's safe to say, and I've done a lot of work on this, and I'm not glib about it, that the levels of pesticides, the residues of pesticides in food, are very unlikely to cause any harm whatsoever. However, long-term exposure to high levels, and particularly cocktails of levels, could have a long-term effect. And can I give you a very specific example? When pesticides are licensed, as I said, we look at the risks and benefits, but we only look at particular toxicological risks, and those are the risks that are known at the time the pesticide goes for licensing. Sometimes things crop up later. And of course, what doesn't happen is we don't go back and review that pesticide and say we're going to take it off the market. That would only occur under a very formal review process, like the EPA might carry out in New Zealand. And we're beginning to find that quite a lot of chemicals, this is one of my research areas, so if you were my students, you'd all go, oh, at this stage. We begin to find that some chemicals mimic the female hormone, and that these can have quite profound effects on growth and development at incredibly low concentrations. DDT is an example of one of these, and some other pesticides also fall into the same category. That was not known when the pesticides were licensed. And so the MRL and the acceptable daily intake are all based, if not indirectly, on levels of pesticides that were needed to cause particular toxicological effects, but not an estrogenic effect where the level would be very, very much lower. So there is some concern amongst toxicologists at the moment that these sort of long-term exposures to pesticides that might have estrogenic effects really haven't been taken account of in the regulatory process. And there are other things too, which I'm not necessarily going to go into, but that are beginning to appear now, that we're beginning to see that can occur following very long-term exposure time.
So how often is there a review process?
Yeah, the review processes are irregular. What should be happening in most countries, I think it is. I think the regulatory authorities in most countries are pretty good. You know, they're trying to stop us getting hurt. They're not trying to hide it. But I'll give you an example of where there might be in a few minutes' time. But the review process, about every 5 years, good regulatory authority would look at their battery of licensed pesticides, and they would be keeping an eye on the literature, the scientific literature, and say, well, you know, there's a bit of new stuff around here. Perhaps we should review this. There's usually a fairly anti-reviewing lobby from the agricultural industry because it may mean that they lose some stuff that's really important to them. And in New Zealand, that's been particularly so around Roundup, the glyphosate-containing herbicide. And, you know, it's beginning to look like the EPA might review it, but they were really resisting this big time. And the farmers are resisting it hugely big time because it's so very important to them. But if there's new evidence, they're almost duty-bound to go and review this if they believe that new evidence might have an impact on human health.
So following on from Emma's question actually is, so reviews are done every 5 years. The MRL levels are set and it's almost like it's an honesty system. You know, this is how much you should use, don't use more of it. But where's the control? And then obviously you've spoken about the cocktail effect. So MRL levels are set for particular individual pesticides or toxins, if we want to call it that, but then there's the compound effect. So again, going back to the consumer, we really just don't know. There's no way of knowing. There isn't a little label stuck on and there's this percentage, that percentage, etc. So to limit, I guess, and again, this might overlap with some of the other sort of topics we'll talk about, how much of those toxins are actually absorbed within the food and how much can be
washed off.
Washed off. So it could be on the outer skin, and how much actually remains in the soil. So it's sprayed on the crop. How much of that ends up in the actual food that we're consuming?
That's a very good question. It depends on the pesticide. And most pesticides, or no, that's not true. A lot of pesticides are absorbed into the crop, and therefore they will be in the actual juice or in the cells of the plant material. A lot aren't. And for example, some of the herbicides that are used on oranges, you might know that 2,4-D is a herbicide, and it's used actually not to kill oranges, but to make them ripen at the same time because it mimics the plant hormone auxin, and so therefore you spray it and all the oranges ripen at the same time. You might wonder why. You know, you drive around orange groves, they're all orange. You've got an orange tree in your garden and they're not all orange. Well, it's because they've sprayed them to do that. But those pesticides are not very well absorbed, so they'll actually be on the outside of the orange. And again, I did a study as part of the Pesticide Residues Committee in the UK, looking at the levels of pesticide residues in orange juice to see if they actually got there from the skin. And they don't. And so the residues in some of the foods that we would eat that are related to the fruits that you might peel are very, very much lower than if you measure the pesticide on the whole fruit itself. Now, most of the regulatory authorities measure commutated fruit, which means they mash the whole thing up and measure it in that. So you get the overall level. but a lot of that will still be on the outside. And another good example, and then I'll shut up a bit on this one, but is wheat, for example. A lot of pesticides are applied to wheat post-harvest. And I didn't really realize how big this problem was until we moved to New Zealand. And, any crops that we go out and stuff in our garden, and I'm battling constantly with insects and rabbits and God knows what else comes to eat in the middle of the night, Mr. Possum, whoever. And so therefore, if you're growing wheat, the weevil beetle is a real problem. The wheat is stored in great big silos, and at night the weevils are flying around and they think, it's all their birthdays come at once. There's 10 tons of the stuff, and in they go and they chew the whole lot up. So you apply pesticides to the wheat in the silos. And those pesticides are not taken up by the wheat because the plant's dead at that stage, but they're stuck to the outside. So this is where sort of the counterintuitivity, if that's a good word, comes out. Because if you use white flour, the residues of those pesticides are incredibly low because they're stuck to the outside of the wheat. If you use brown flour, which is the whole lot, which is good for you,
try to be healthy.
then the pesticides are at much higher levels. And that I was really surprised when we did the study because I thought we got it wrong, actually. And I asked my scientist people to go back out there and collect samples again and do a few more until one of the bright buds said, well, of course, it's obvious, isn't it?
It makes sense.
And then, of course, if you take the outside off, we don't throw it away. That's brown, and we put it into special cage, we didn't say that, or something like that.
So brown's actually a more concentrated form of some of the issues. Wow, okay.
It can be. It's not necessarily. It's not.
Yeah, of course.
Totally, but it can be. Yeah, just depends how the pesticide's been applied.
Going back to your orange example, because we peel the skin, we don't eat the skin. I mean, although ironically, sometimes we use the orange or lemon rind, which we're saying, okay, great concentrations of the pesticide. Here we go.
Yeah.
So, is there then a difference between? I mean, I've come across, Emma, you probably have as well. The people come up with wonderful lists of the dirty 12 or the cleaner 12 and so on. So. Something comes to mind, strawberries. We eat the skin, and it's quite a permeable outer. So are some foods more susceptible to absorbing more of the pesticides, basically, is the question.
Yeah, they would be. Yeah, I mean, things like oranges have got a very waxy surface, and most of the pesticides are fairly fat-soluble. And that's so they get taken up by insects. And so the waxy surface takes them up very well. And so they sit on the outside and they don't go any further. DDT is a classic for that. It sits in the outside of our cell membranes and never actually gets into our cell, which is probably why it doesn't have any great effect on us. So, yeah, some of them are. But, the sort of things you're talking about, like strawberries and figs and all these things, are not that regularly eaten. I mean, we go crazy at them in the summer, but the overall dose is very low. And I think the implications of that are quite small. I've been much more worried about flour and potatoes, and bread that might be manufactured from flour. And that's not a dismissive answer. We absolutely definitely don't want residues exceeding the MRL or particularly the ADI on anything, but it's very unlikely to on something like a strawberry.
So should we all be washing our fresh produce in vinegar or soap, or should we be doing these things before
should we be
put
washing
them
our
in
flour?
Yeah.
Well, I've always got an answer for everything. Whether the answer is correct or not is the other question, isn't it? But I did actually do a study on this many years ago with a very a good friend of mine called Caroline Harris, who was the secretary of the Pesticide Residues Committee in the UK, and we decided because we had a representative of the community on the committee as well, and she was always going crazy about everything. And she said, "Look, how about putting a slice of lemon in my gin and tonic? Will it extract the pesticides from the lemon?" Of course, it will. So she said, well, should I wash it? And we said, well, you could. And if you wash it with detergent, it will certainly take the pesticides off. So we did a study just to see what would be the toxicological significance of that. And we found, in fact, that the toxicological significance was worse if you'd washed it with a detergent than if you just left the pesticide on there, because the detergent was more toxic than the pesticide at the levels that were present. It's not intrinsically more toxic than the pesticide, but at the levels that were present. I mean, if it matters what I do, and I don't think it does, I wash everything, but not with detergent. Warm water, wash it all, and then eat it.
Yep, brilliant. I do the same, absolutely. So just to pivot a little bit, what about the natural toxins and things? So to all the peanut butter lovers out there, or the people that eat a lot of corn, should they be worried
Careful
about
with your answer here.
We've got peanut butter man over there, I think. Yes. Well,
You've already ruined the brown flour, so I'm just going to go to white bread now. So peanut butter on white bread.
well, you just wait. You're never going to eat peanuts again. I can tell you that now. This is a very, very good question. And the reason is that most of the natural toxins are very, very much more toxic than any of the pesticides we ever apply to anything. And we can't control them very easily either. So they're always going to be present. If you eat a parsnip, it's going to contain furocoumarins. They do cause cancer. There is no issue about that whatsoever. And you've got to eat a lot of parsnip to get cancer, but they are carcinogenic. If they were pesticides, we would not allow them to be licensed. So that's a very important statement. So if you think of something like peanut butter, the peanuts can go moldy if they're not stored properly, and the mold can produce a toxin, which is incredibly toxic, and it is a carcinogen. Aflatoxin is a carcinogen. Most countries around the world now regulate the levels of aflatoxin in peanuts. And I'll tell you why in a few minutes' time. And so in New Zealand, for example, we have a particular level that's allowed. So all the peanuts that are imported, the levels will be measured by the people manufacturing peanut butter, for example. They'll all be blended together so the final product doesn't have a level of aflatoxin that exceeds the statutory limit. Some of the peanuts coming in will have huge levels, but providing it's all balanced out by the whole lot being homogenized together and measured, then it's okay. Now, that's a very sensible approach, actually. Dilute and distribute, and that makes it safer in that context. But the reason for this, and now there's a little country to the west of New Zealand called, what's it called? Australia. That's
full of troublemakers, I hear.
And the Americans think it's the same place as New Zealand. They think we're joined to you, actually, but we're not. And we must say that now. And Australia produces peanuts, and it produces very high quality peanuts. And Australia has very good weather, which we don't have in New Zealand. And it's sunny a lot of the time and dry a lot of the time. And therefore, the peanuts can be stored and they don't go moldy. New Zealand used to buy all of its peanuts from Australia. And we had little problem with aflatoxin. The problem with Australia is the buggers in Australia charge a rather large amount of money for their extremely nice peanuts. Now, there's another country a little bit further away called China. And China grows peanuts too. It's very humid and not quite like Australia. Parts of it are, but most of it isn't. And their peanuts are very cheap. And so a lot of countries buy their peanuts from China now. And when they're stored and transported, the conditions aren't good and they go moldy and the aflatoxin levels are going up. And that's almost certainly, I've been told off about saying this, but I'm almost certain it's due to the sourcing of the peanuts rather than the peanuts themselves. If they're stored properly, they're much safer. But the regulations in individual countries, as I say, to balance out those levels, make the peanut butter safe at the end of the day. But a lot of people might think, I don't particularly like that. It's been made from stuff that contains a chemical that causes cancer. Good God, I'm not eating peanut butter again.
So this is an economic decision. Rather than discarding a batch saying the levels are too high, let's dilute it and then we're not wasting. I mean, that's really why that's happening, rather than common sense. Let's avoid the problem so there isn't the risk of getting the mixing wrong or whatever the case is. I mean,
well, there wouldn't be a risk of getting the mixing wrong because the batches will have to be tested.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and again, the dose makes a poison.
It does. Good old Paracelsus. Yeah, absolutely. And it's not only economic. Obviously, it's economic, of course, but we don't want to waste the food either. So if you've got a food that's contaminated, providing you dilute that contamination to a safe level, then you're okay.
Okay. All right, so I'm just mindful of time, so I'm going to jump to the next subject now. You've done some really interesting TEDx talks where you've talked about some of those endocrine-disrupting chemicals that you touched on before. Could you tell us a little bit about your work in this space? It's fascinating.
Yeah. There are a whole load of chemicals that look a little bit like the female hormone, which is called 17-beta estradiol. And this hormone binds, I'm doing it with my hands, it's no good on the radio, is it? This binds to a receptor like a lock and key. And the receptor's a very specific shape. And when the hormone binds, it changes the shape of that receptor and it goes into the nucleus of the cell, switches on a whole load of stuff, which makes women beautiful and men ugly, basically. But it does a load of other stuff as well. I mean, it controls all sorts of cellular development mechanisms, particularly in the embryo. And it initiates the development of the brain, for example. Now, before you think what my students always think, that's why women are cleverer than men, is nothing to do with it. And in fact, they're not. So we're just going to get that sorted out straight away.
I don't believe you.
I thought you wouldn't. You're biased. You see, Ben's keeping very quiet at this stage.
I've learned.
Exactly. Even though you're a long way away, you're scared. But if you have another chemical that looks a little bit like the female hormone, it might fit into this lock and key mechanism in the receptor and switch it on in just the same way. And we now know that there are about 850 chemicals that we know of that look like estrogen. But they're not the same, and so they're nowhere near as active as estrogen itself. So DDT is an example. And it's a millionth of the activity of estrogen. So you'd need 1 million times the amount to get the same effect as estrogen. But there are quite a lot of these chemicals around now, and so we are getting small doses of lots of them, and this is where the cocktail effect is really important, because they're all binding to the same receptor in our food and from our environmental exposures and so on. And as time goes by, new chemicals are being found, and one good example is glyphosate from Roundup that has estrogenic effects, but we know now in my laboratory exactly why, and I've got the paper here that we're just submitting for publication, but it's not yet been published. So, I mean, we know that it has a mimicking approach because of the way it can actually interact with the receptor, even though it looks nothing like estrogen. So we're beginning to see now that this mimicking estrogen is very diverse in the way that it can do it. And we're going to find more and more and more chemicals that do this.
So I'm really interested in what the definition in this case is of mimicking, because watching your TEDx talks, you also talk about soy having similar effects. To what extent does that actually mean?
I mean, the stuff in soy is called genistein, and that has a very, very close resemblance to the female hormone estrogen, and it fits the receptor very well. It's about 10,000th to 100,000th of the activity of estrogen, so that's incredibly high. But I wrote a paper once entitled "Real Men Don't Eat Soy," and I thought that was quite funny at the time. But looking back on it, it wasn't really a very good thing to say. But it's very difficult to explain this because it will have no effect on you whatsoever, because that one exposure is very unlikely to do anything. But multiple exposures over long periods of time can. And the epidemiological evidence that's coming forward now, and this started in the 1990s with Lisbeth Carlson doing work in Denmark, where she showed that the human sperm count is declining. And then some work done by Shana Swan, who was actually interviewed on New Zealand radio, lovely woman from America last week. I love her dearly. She's a lovely New York Jew who shouts at me all the time on the telephone, and I just love her. But she linked together some exposures to chemicals that are estrogenic and some of the effects of estrogenic compounds like reducing sperm count. And what we've seen over the years are that the sperm count is going down. You can't prove that's due to estrogens, but it certainly looks like it is. We've shown that female puberty is starting earlier, and there's been some studies in China recently that's shown that girls at 4 to 6 are beginning to develop puberty. Not all of them, but some girls are. And if you think about it, the way that puberty is initiated is by a sudden increase in estrogen levels at a certain stage in the girl's development. But if you give them constant low doses of chemicals that mimic estrogen, it will switch on that process earlier. And the other thing that's increasing is the incidence of breast cancer. And 80% of breast cancers express the estrogen receptor in their cells, and they're stimulated to divide by estrogen. So we're suggesting, by we, I don't mean my group only, but the world community of scientists in this area, is that estrogen mimics are what is causing this. And there was a big World Health Organization study completed in 1992, which basically said the WHO links these effects with exposure to estrogenic compounds.
Okay, so I've got a really quick question then, specifically on the soy products, because a lot of those bioactive components in soy have been associated with positive health benefits. And I know, I am aware that some of the in vitro science has used that genistein in extremely high concentrations that you wouldn't
absolutely.
be getting
That's a good point.
Consume it in your diet. In your view, can soy be a part of a balanced diet? I know we've got a lot of veggie listeners, so...
No, of course you can,
And it's interesting, and I just want to add to that, because going in two ways, because you talk about, for instance, earlier onset or puberty coming on earlier in China, with young adolescents. But at the same time, there's also been studies that have shown, again, like Emma said, the positive effects of soy, and even when looking at recovery from breast cancer, that soy has actually had a positive effect. So it's kind of incongruent to each other. And also the increase in dairy consumption at the same time during these current studies in China. So it's kind of, where is it coming from? So
I mean, it's very difficult. There's a very good association. I think that's the best way to put it. But we'll never prove it. But in animal studies, I mean, the sort of stuff I do, I grow, or I say it's my PhD students, just in case they listen to this. I've never been anywhere near the bloody lab, basically. But we grow. They don't let me in. They're a few. But we grow cancer cells. We grow breast cancer cells which are expressing the estrogen receptor, and we expose them to doses of chemicals that we think are estrogenic to see if they grow, and if they grow, they're estrogenic, and if they're not, they don't. And to give you an idea, 10 to the minus 12 molar, so that's 0.000000000000001 molar estrogen will cause the cells to divide like crazy. And if you look at genistein, 10 to the minus 10 molar genistein will cause them to grow. That's infinitesimally tiny concentration. If you look at the levels, which I don't know what they are, but they are very, very much higher than that in soy. So if you eat soy, you will eat enough estrogen to cause the estrogen receptor to be occupied and it to do what it does. Now, if you're a postmenopausal woman or perimenopausal, one of the problems, and my mother always used to tell me this, one of the problems that women have at that stage is they get withdrawal from estrogen. They get hot flushes, they feel sick, they feel miserable, and all these things because they're just learning how not to have their receptors occupied. If those women eat foods rich in estrogen mimics, they feel better. And there are breads on the market in New Zealand that actually say on the label, thought to be good. They've got to be careful how they say it, but, thought to be good for postmenopausal women. And similarly, following breast cancer, when you've had the surgery, some of the estrogens will stimulate regrowth of the breast and regrowth of breast tissue. They'll also stimulate regrowth of any cancer cells that are there as well. But you hope the surgeon's taken them all out. So there are pros and cons. And some of the work that we've done, and a lot of other people as well, have got exactly the same result as us. If you look at breast cancer cells and you give them very low doses of genistein, they grow. If you give them very high doses, they stop growing. And so it looks like the amount you take determines its effect. It's called a bell-shaped curve, and it's very common with hormones. But it means that it's very difficult for me to answer a question which you've not asked me, how much should we eat of this? Because there isn't an answer. Because at low levels they do one thing, at high levels they do the other, but we don't know what the bit in the middle, where the bit in the middle is, and what is a high dose and what is a low dose. We just know they're different at these doses. This is a terrible answer to your question, and that's because a lot of the science in this area is currently quite in its infancy, and we're just getting to grips with it at the moment. I produced a book about 6-7 years ago now called Endocrine-Disrupting Chemicals in Food, and I edited it, and there's a whole lot of experts from around the world, including Shannon Swan, who wrote chapters on their areas. And at the end, I wanted to write the sort of epilogue to it to say, well, there we are, it's all having an effect, isn't it? And I finished up by saying, well, there we are. I'm in the dark now, and I was at the beginning, and I still am at the end. And we'd sort of got nowhere except to review the literature, which is all over the place.
Yeah,
basically.
That's nutrition science. There's so many shades of grey. It gets a bit frustrating
Absolutely.
sometimes. But
yeah, it is. Yeah.
So we've covered the DDT and the soy. BPA, should we be avoiding this in our canned goods?
Yeah, we should. There's no question about that. Yeah. I mean, that's something we can avoid. Sorry, that was a terrible pun. In fact, I hope no one caught on to that one. Yeah, but we can. And if the BPA is an estrogen mimic, it's to talk like I talk normally, it's got two hydroxyl groups separated by 10 angstroms, which is just the same as 17 beta estradiol. It's about 10,000th of the activity of 17 beta estradiol, the female hormone. It's metabolized very quickly in humans. It disappears very quickly from the circulatory system. So its long-term effects are minimal. But we're exposed to it all over the place. So You might have plastic containers that you put your food in the deep freeze and then take it out and put it in the microwave. Nasty thing to do, if I think. And it will definitely move from the plastic into the food. The old cling films contained phthalates, which are not the same as BPA, but they do the same thing. And this migrated from the cling films into the food. And you may remember, I'm looking at you. You're too young, but in the good old days, cling film, you put it over your food, you bung it in the microwave, and it was sort of crinkly when you brought it out.
Don't forget you had to poke a few holes in the plastic.
You did, in case it blew up. Yeah.
I'm not that young.
But it was sort of wrinkly when it came out, and the reason was the plasticizers had gone, and they'd gone into the food. But we can do without all of these things, and so therefore we can get rid of them. It's a big job to get rid of them, but we can, and I think we should, because they're adding to this cocktail of daily exposures to chemicals. And I was just reading a study actually for a lecture I'm giving soon, just the other day, which was looking at, they all happen to be women, but they don't need to be, who were working in an American supermarket on the checkout. And I didn't realize until I read this article that the till receipts are coated with BPA. And there was a lovely study carried out, which you probably know about, and I've talked about in many of my papers actually recently. There was a lovely study carried out that showed that when the girls, as they happen to be, or the women they happen to be, were handing, would you like your receipt, madam or sir? They were getting a dose of BPA, and you could see it increasing in their blood after they started on their shift. And again, we don't need that BPA on the outside of paper. We could think of some other way of doing that. So, I mean, my answer really is we should get rid of things that we don't need in order to minimize the total exposure. Whereas soy, for example, it's good to eat, it's nice to eat, it's nutritious, it's got all the things we need, it's got a bit of genistein in it. What the hell? Eat that. But you don't want to have a diet that's totally based on soy. And there are some real cranks out there who do that sort of thing. Well, that's stupid. Have a good, well-balanced diet, and that's the way to survive, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so speeding along, I'm looking at the clock. What about genetically modified foods? I know this is a very controversial area with a lot of emotion behind the debate again. And of course, you've always got the vested interest from big companies. But I know FSANZ regulates the use of GM crops pretty tightly in Australia and New Zealand. So is this an area of concern for people?
No.
Short and sweet.
But I'll tell you why, because that's too short and sweet, isn't it? I mean, from an environmental perspective, there are big issues. And I get very heated about this and give talks to women's institutes and U3As and all sorts about it. But from a human health perspective, the risk is infinitesimally tiny. And there are two sorts of levels of risk. The first is that if you eat a food that's been genetically modified, then you will eat those genetically modified genes and they will get into your body, but they will just get broken down in your stomach and everything. Now, there's some work that shows that some of these might get taken up by bacteria, and it's called horizontal gene transfer, and they may get transferred from one gene to another in bacteria and so on. There's evidence for that. What it does to us, we don't know. So there's a bit of an uncertainty there. Other foods that we might eat, like corn oil, for example, from genetically modified corn, will have no genes in whatsoever because it's the oil, and the oil doesn't contain any of the DNA. But we then might feed the waste to cattle. Then the cattle are getting that gene. The biggest issue, just to touch on the environmental side, is, of course, these genes are out there. They're in the pollen. They're in everything else. They might be transferred to another plant that might be related to it. And then that plant develops the traits of whatever your gene gave to the plant that it would put in artificially, like, for example, resistance to glyphosate, in Roundup ready crops. And FSANZ very carefully regulates, as you say, genetically modified crops. I think, but I don't know, for two reasons. One is that the public are worried about them, and therefore there's a public perception issue that we've got to say, well, actually, we do regulate these things very carefully. FSANZ will tell me off for that, I would think. And secondly, because we don't know some of the potential effects, even though as a scientist, I would look at these potential effects and say, well, I think they're going to be minuscule, if a problem at all. And in the big play of risks, they're very, very low indeed. But the environmental risk is very great. And of course, none of these products are allowed to be grown in New Zealand. They're banned completely. Whereas if you go to the States, you see, hectare upon hectare of Roundup ready crops, and they're spraying constantly with Roundup to keep the weeds down, and the crop's growing perfectly well.
Yeah. So the environmental side of things,
I think, is the issue. Yeah. And I mean, personally, this is, as a scientist, I shouldn't say what I'm about to say, but I think you're beginning to know that I don't care about things like that. And personally, I think we should not have genetically modified crops. And I think, initially they were produced for all the right reasons. And Monsanto, great company, producing wonderful things, very clever scientists, the whole works. They said, this is going to solve the food problem in the third world. Well, it isn't, because they cost so much money, the third world can't afford to buy them. And that was the message that they got them out there on. But what they have done is revolutionize the production of products for the first world and allowed them to be produced much cheaper. The environmental impact we really haven't assessed and really don't know, but we know that it's potentially great.
Yeah. So it's kind of, they've ridden the wave of golden rice and it's turned into something completely different.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that was exactly the way it started. Yeah. That was going to be a savior. The B vitamins, no one's going to get beriberi anymore. It's all going to be fantastic.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of different factors and considerations. Just very quickly, what about in pregnancy? Does a pregnant mum need to be doing anything different in terms to, worrying about exposure?
I think this is a very, very good question. And why it's a very good question is, of course, when that little nipper's developing in mum's uterus, it's getting all of its nutrients from mum, from via the placenta. Now, the placenta, and in theory, of course, it gets all the residues of pesticides and chemicals in the food that mum's eating as well. But the placenta's designed to protect the baby from a whole lot of stuff. And it does. It protects the baby from all sorts of natural things that you don't want to cross, like estrogen. Because if you've got a boy child developing in there and the mother's shooting estrogen at it, it's not going to do it very good. And so what happens is the placenta stops estrogen going across by metabolizing it and send it back through to the mum. But, and I've done a study on this in collaboration with the University of Auckland, actually, about 10 years ago, where we looked at the uptake of chemicals across the placenta in human placenta that have been, we took at the point of parturition and put tubes into the two veins so we could put a chemical in one side and see what came out the other side, basically. And we showed that if you put estrogen in, it doesn't come out the other side because the system's really quite good and it stops it. If you put BPA in, it comes straight through because the placenta doesn't recognize it. It doesn't see it as being foreign because when the placenta evolved, it didn't evolve with BPA in its environment. And so it just goes not quite straight through, but pretty well straight through. And genistein, interestingly, goes through to the child, but nowhere near as well as BPA because it's structurally much closer to estrogen and it gets metabolized in the same way. So the point is that these chemicals can get through to the child and they will have an impact on the child's development. There's no question about that. And if you look at Louis Goulet's experiments in the States on alligators, when he showed that the alligators in Lake Apopka had shorter penises than the ones in Lake Woodruff, that was almost certainly due to the effect of DDT on the developing alligator in its eggs. And you can show that a lot of experiments have been done now that's sort of not proved, but pretty well proved that that's the case. And so the effect on the developing embryo is really important. And that's because if a child is developing into a male and its receptors, it'll have estrogen receptors there, but they won't be occupied. Get occupied by a bit of BPA that's come across from mum because she just ate something from a food container that she's microwaved, then that will immediately switch on those receptors. Bonk. Now, it won't keep them going for long, but if it's a constant flux of this, it will have an effect. And one of the questions that is being asked at the moment, and people like Shanna Swan actually are asking this, and I certainly am, is are some of the effects we're seeing as a result of in utero exposure rather than exposure of adults? Because that would actually hit the development right at its initiation rather than later on. So, for example, the sperm count, it might not be that we're exposed directly, but when we were in utero, the cells that produce our sperm were exposed and we now don't have as many of them because it looks like you can't reverse some of these effects, even by removing estrogen. So, yeah, there's a definite potential for effects on the embryo. And, we just don't understand this. It's intensely complex. But it's very obvious that some of these things are going to affect that developmental process.
Let's talk about the final topic, and it's probably something our listeners have been waiting on, is the whole organic debate. It's a very marketable brand, a term to put on packaging and put on labels and so on. People believe organic's better. Well, is it better? So let's first talk about what are the pros and cons and any misconceptions that come along with the term organic.
Yeah, I think there are two things we've got to look at. One is our health, and secondly is our environment's health. Organic production is better for the environment, no question, absolutely none. I eat as much organic food as I possibly can because I care about the environment. It probably makes not a jot of difference to our own health. And there's a little bit of a possibility of it making a difference. There's been a lot of studies carried out, and even I did a study many years ago on pesticide residues in organic food, and we found actually that the span of pesticides was pretty well the same as in non-organic food. And the reason for that was possibly twofold. You never prove this. One is spray drift and soil contamination generally. Although the organic movements that approve farms will measure levels of pesticides in the soil, and that's not that naive. But secondly, there are a lot of unscrupulous people out there, and you get more money for organic. So if you stick a label on saying organic, you get more money. And it might well be that the flour that was used to make organic bread may in fact not be organic, and that might be why the pesticides are there. But certainly in the study we carried out, we found pretty well as much pesticide in the organic foods as we did in the non-organic foods. And when we looked more closely at that, the organic foods tended to be more whole foods like bread, whole wheat bread, and of course we just talked about the way that the grain is stored, so you'd expect to have higher levels in any case, and so that was bolstering the levels in those foods. But from the point of view of the environment, it's 1,000 times better. There's no question about that. There was also, and I've done a little bit of literature work about this, in fact, for the book I wrote on food safety, just looking at the levels of nutrients in food and whether the levels are higher in organic food than non-organic food. And the literature's all over the place with this. But if you sort of get a piece of paper, which I did, and put a tick when I read a paper that said it was better, and a cross when it said it wasn't, I got more ticks than crosses. And that was almost certainly because organic food takes longer to grow. If you give your crops a whole load of nitrates and superphosphate and all that sort of stuff, and you spray them with as many pesticides as you can, they'll grow much faster because they're not getting competed with by insects, and they're not getting eaten by insects rather than competed with by other weeds. So organic food takes longer to grow, and so some of the nutrients in there will get to higher concentrations because the food is older when you pick it, and therefore might have more vitamin C or vitamin whatever else there might be in there. But I think it's quite marginal, and I don't think that would be a particularly good reason for eating organic food.
Well, a message we always tell our listeners and people we engage with is, don't be obsessed with organic, because if there's the option of not eating the produce because it's not organic, it's better to eat it, because the overwhelming benefits of still getting all those other nutrients, all those phytonutrients and vitamins, minerals and so on, still supersedes the ill effects of the pesticides.
The long and short of it is that if you eat a good, broad, balanced diet, my idea of a balanced diet is every night, light the candle, a glass of wine, and 2 courses. And one of them's got to be very sweet. And every night it's different. Well, that's not true. But, most nights it's different. And that's a good, well-balanced meal. And if we can buy organic, we do, because it helps the environment. I would only buy animals that are being humanely kept. And the organic movement tends to do that. So we tend to buy organic meat because it's being better kept. We keep our own chickens so that we know they're running around having fun and the eggs haven't been produced in a horrible way. And I think if you do all those sorts of things, part of it makes you feel better, part of it helps the environment, and part of it helps you to be healthy. And I think if we get too uptight about only eating organic, it can very much restrict your diet, and that could be bad.
And I'm betting you're also supporting smaller businesses as well, rather than massive corporations.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I think a really nice way to wrap up this show is a way you've wrapped up one of your TEDx talks, and that is the story of the happy banana.
Yes.
So would you like to tell us the story about the happy banana?
I would, but well, let's go back a stage first. Dopamine is a really important neurotransmitter that's present in the brain, and the dopamine levels and serotonin levels are to do with your happiness level. And if your dopamine levels go, this is a bit it's sort of high level. But if they go up, you tend to be happier, and if they're down, you tend to be lower. And any chemicals that mimic or interfere with them make you feel better as well. Bananas contain quite high levels of dopamine. And so you might think, oh, great, I'll eat plenty of bananas. You get as fat as anything if you did. But, you eat plenty of bananas and I'm going to be happy all the time. The problem is that the brain restricts the uptake of dopamine because it can't allow dopamine to cross the blood-brain barrier into the brain. And so you can eat as many bananas as you like and your dopamine levels simply won't go up. And so even though there's a chemical in food, it still might not have the effects on you that you expect by just looking at the chemistry or biochemistry of that particular chemical. So bananas are not necessarily the happy food, although they make you smile, don't they? I remember that TEDx talk, I just put the banana on the screen and the audience laughed and I didn't understand why.
Well, it's having that effect now, so there we go. And to our listeners, if they're still wondering about crocodiles and their penises and the banana story, and we'll put some links to those TEDx talks. They're fascinating, they're highly entertaining. And on that note, Professor Ian Shaw, we really thank you for your time and your fascinating insight into the real, I don't know what to call it, but the real ins of the chemistry behind the foods we eat, and that's all the external chemicals and toxins and so on that we're inadvertently consuming without realizing and their effects. So thank you so much for educating us, and it's been a real treat. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me along very much indeed. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Lentil Intervention podcast. If you found this interesting, make sure you subscribe and share it with your friends.